I've got a faster way to ink blend perfectly smooth panels. Let me show you. I love the look of a good ink blended panel, and I've been practicing it for a long time, like a long time. Before I show you my new way to get a similar look, here's my best tips for getting a smooth blend the old-fashioned way. Let me start by talking about this turntable that I'm using, along with the grip mat. These two tools go under the category of work in a way that's comfortable for you. The grip mat holds the cardstock in place and prevents any slipping, as well as freeing up your other hand if you want. The mat also stays in place on the turntable, which was a real game changer for me for both ink blending and coloring. I like to blend my ink from left to right, and having a turntable underneath my work allows me to easily change the position. I'm using the all-too-new blending brushes because I like the control I get from holding onto them right over the bristles. Hold on, I just need to quickly refill this Mandarin Spice ink pad, which brings me to another tip. Make sure that your ink pads are full and juicy. That'll make it so much easier to get the ink onto your panel without too much strain on your arm or hands. Also, choose a smooth cardstock. One that's coated will keep the ink sitting on top longer before it soaks in, and that allows for faster blending. I'm using Hammermill. The next, and really the best tip, is to really saturate your cardstock with the ink, whichever kind you're using. The wetter it is, the smoother your blend will be. This takes time and layers of ink. Layers is really the key. I don't worry about getting a smooth blend in my first layer. I allow it to build up by going over it again and again until I'm happy with it. I changed out my spiced ink for terracotta to get it a bit redder rather than the orange going into brown. Finally, I would say just know your inks. I know, for instance, that my Catherine Pooler inks are going to smooth out and dry back a little bit in color over time. Okay, now that's pretty, and I'll show it to you again in a few minutes when it's dry. And now here's my faster way to get a similar look. Use a gel plate. And right off the top, if you don't have a gel plate, but you do have some kind of grip mat, try using that. This is a 5x7-inch gel plate, and I started by putting down my Mandarin Spice ink and Skylight ink. I had refilled the Skylight pad, so there's quite a bit of ink on there. Next, I used my Brayer. This one's 6 inches, which gives the opportunity to get a nice blend in one motion. As I rolled, I moved the brayer slightly up and down to get a blend going on in the middle. You don't want to move too far, especially if you're using more than two colors, but just enough to blur that line between the colors. Next, I took my first pull. This time I'm using index cardstock, which is thicker than printer paper, but not like the 100-pound Hammermill. This pull is pretty faint, and you can see that the dye inks beat up on the gel plate a little bit. But that ink blending tip of layering works for this method too. There's still a lot of ink on the brayer, so I rolled that out back onto the gel plate, still moving the brayer up and down a little bit to continue to get that mix in the middle. I put the paper down to get another pull, and because I'm not being precise in where the paper goes on the plate, that's another opportunity for the colors to blend in the center. Now I'm getting deeper colors, but it's still not quite comparable to the ink blending, so I'm going to repeat these steps one more time. At this point, I figured out that if I put the navy down right at the top of the gel plate, I won't get any of it on my panel when I cut it down later to use on my card. So I pounced a strip a couple of inches down from the top before adding the Skylight, then the Mandarin, and finally the terracotta, also about an inch from the bottom. I left space between the strips of color so I wasn't contaminating my ink pads, and varying the gel plate will help the colors to move. I put my paper down on the plate and I rubbed over it to pick up the ink, and now I'm getting into the depth of color I'm looking for. I've still got ink on the brayer, so I rolled that back onto the gel plate and I did one final pull. So now when I compare the gel print to the blended panel on the right is brighter, with more distinction between the two blues and the two oranges. I think the brightness comes from a couple of things. One, it's drier than the gel print at this point. Hammermill is a coated cardstock and it keeps the ink on the surface longer. But the index paper, because it's so thin, it's saturated very quickly. That means that the color is really sunk right down into it, and it's really wet. So we'll take another look at it a little bit later. Number two is that I have no idea what was on my gel plate before I started. It's stained yellow from use with alcohol inks, and I also used watercolor powders and acrylic paints on it. So that may have left some residue that's been picked up on this print. But then I thought, why not try the gel plate with the hammermill cardstock, and that'll give us another comparison. So the same idea, 4 colors on the plate, brayer them out, and do a few layers to really deepen the colors. When I thought I was getting too much navy, I just left it out of the next layer to let that skylight really get more coverage, so it's easy to adjust that way too. I used a larger sheet of paper to keep my hands clean while I was pressing down on the cardstock panel. I find that if I'm trying to avoid getting my hands inky when I'm pressing down, I tend not to get even pressure on the edges of the panel. So here's a look at all 3 of my panels: ink blended on hammermill, gel print on hammermill, and gel print on index. These are all in different states of dryness, so hold on for a second. And here we go. Now they're all dry and trimmed down, so we can do a better comparison. Now they're not exactly the same. That glow from the ink blending comes from the areas of pure Mandarin spice and Skylight ink, which kind of got more blended on the gel prints. But on the other hand, the gel printed ones required a lot less effort. I'll show you some other ones I made a bit later with some different colors. But let's use these to make some cards. I'll keep track of which one's which so you can decide later on how different they look. I started by stamping one of the panels with a background stamp from Catherine Pooler and spritzing some water on it before stamping it down. These inks react with water, and this should leave the stamp pattern kind of bleached out of the background. But it can take a minute, so I'll set that aside while everything's still in place, and I'll decide if I want to restamp it again later once it's dried. Next, I used an embossing folder from Spellbinders to add some dimension and texture to another panel. And then I thought I'd try something I haven't done before, and that's adding some solar paste to the embossing to add some shine. I grabbed a domed foam blender, and I used that to apply it to the raised portions, but I probably would have been better off using my finger. The dome shape meant that some of the paste got on the lower areas too. A flat foam tool would actually work better as well, but I don't have any of those anymore. Still, the paste really brought out that geometric pattern, and the little bits of extra shine are very pretty. For the last panel, I grabbed the grip mat and the stencil extender tool that came out recently. I'm still figuring this one out, and one thing I did figure out is that when you're adding your stencil to it with the little cutout flaps, make sure that the stencil is between the extender and the grip mat. The grip mat will hold both the stencil and the extender in place, but if you have the stencil on top, it can still shift within those little cutout flaps, especially if you're using a full cardstock panel. Anyway, after all that, I used the circle mask that came with the extender to block out an area on the panel before adding this rippling square stencil from a Colorful Life Designs. I wasn't sure if that circle would stay in place, but it seemed to, as I added layers of ink over top in about the same places that they were on the panel underneath. Next, I took another look at the stamp panel and decided, yes, I would spritz and stamp it again with the water to make the stamping more visible, and then that had to dry some more. Now, this has nothing to do with ink blending or gel printing, but one thing I discovered ages ago is that a little shimmery paste on craft cardstock makes a really pretty gold color. So I grabbed that solar paste again. This one's called Golden Hour, by the way. And I used that dome blender to just apply it to the edges of 3 mats I had cut slightly bigger than my colored panels. I did kind of get brush stroke marks from the foam tools, but I think that little bit of added texture will work well with these dark panels. Oh my goodness, then I went a little wild. I had some paste left over on my glass mat, and I thought I would try adding a little water to it and using it as splatter on my panels. Well, the first one ended up with some pretty big splatters, so I tried to be a little gentler with the second one, and that worked better. But then the third one went big again, so that's obviously something I need to practice a bit more. I don't hate it, but I definitely prefer to have more control over it. And now, just before I glue these together, here's one more look. Same order, ink blended hammermill with the stenciling, gel plate hammermill with embossing, and gel plate index with water stamping. I finished the first one with an older thank you die cut sentiment from Concord and Knight and some espresso pearls from Pretty Pink Posh. For the second one, I added a stamped sentiment from Avery L backed with a circle and strip of the craft that had some of the solar paste applied to it, along with some red illusion gems from Crafty Meraki. And finally, I added a Lawn Fawn Happy Birthday sentiment die cut from Inca Gold cardstock, along with Enchanted Forest gems from Crafty Meraki. Here's a few more panels that I made while I was playing, starting with a really pretty pastel one, as well as some others that I added a stencil onto the gel plate for some added texture. And here's a look at my 3 cards together. Do you remember which one's which? If you still like the look of the ink blended panel best because of that brightness, what about a hybrid technique? Use the gel press for the 2 main colors, and then do a little ink blending on the ends. I guess I should have thought of that one earlier. I think it turned out the best. That's index cardstock, but I still got the brightness that I got with the ink blended hammer mill, and still so much less effort. I know that gel printing is usually known as a method where you want to add a lot of texture, but I think it works really well at getting super smooth results too. I think I'm going to call this technique gel blending. Is it something you would try? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.